Hi again, it's Bob Cusack with Mark Penn. And as we always do in our discussions, Mark, let's talk about your monthly polling in one word. What is the one word that summarizes your most recent data?
I think the one word is Trump.
Trump. Why is that?
Well, because, we're getting late in the political season here, and this is a pivotal moment. People think that elections are decided in the last few weeks, but they're really decided around now, when kind of impressions harden. And so I'm incredibly surprised to see Trump regaining a 4 point lead. Maybe when you factor in all these third party candidates, it might be as much as seven. Don't really know, but bottom line, this is a solid lead for Trump, and the underpinning of that lead is that while 40, I think 44% or believe that Biden did a good job, 55% believe Trump did a good job. And in these situations where they don't like either person, that 11-point gap in who they thought did a better job is likely to be the driving force of the election. And the question for Biden is, can he overturn that judgment in some way? And the question for Trump is, can he stay out of jail in order to reap the benefits of this poll?
Yeah, to that point, as you mentioned, Trump up four in your poll, and you include Stein and West and RFK Jr., and it's up to seven with RFK only. He's up five. So, what about these court appearances? Obviously, the legal stuff only helped Trump in the primary. Do you see any evidence that these appearances, which get a lot of media attention, are not really affecting his numbers?
Well, I think to the extent that these appearances are probably affecting his numbers in some mildly positive direction. The real question is the end game here. If he gets convicted, will it make a difference? And I think that people, the race moves to even or so. If he's convicted on some of these charges, it's a couple of point movement. It's not a 20-point movement, but we don't know. Polls are not very good at predicting uncharted territories, and people are not very good at predicting how they're going to feel when novel events happen. So maybe it's a game changer, maybe not. Maybe he gets acquitted in New York, in which case that'll be, I think, a pretty big game changer, in Trump's direction. But that seems to be the major variable that's out there at this point. People kind of get the issues, they get the people and who they are. Most people think Trump's guilty of something, but they're still voting for him. So
Yeah, and that plays into my next question because in such a remarkable, unusual, I know it's a rematch election, but there's so many weird things going on, even compared to 2020. As you say, 55% in your poll that has Trump up, as most polls do now, think that Trump committed a crime. And yet, yeah, I'll vote for him. At least some portion believe, yeah, he committed a crime, but I'm going to vote for him. How does that mesh?
well, you have to understand what Americans' attitudes towards their political figures generally is. They think they're all crooks.
Right.
So they don't have a very high opinion today of political figures. So in one sense, here there's a number of people who say, "Look, I think he's guilty of something." They're all guilty of something. You know, I think he did a better job. That's really the key determinant. I mean, obviously, Trump's not winning by 11 points. So what makes it four instead of 11? Right? What makes it four instead of 11 is some questions surrounding this, January 6th, elements of abortion, and what's going to happen relative to the Republican Party. I mean, there are a number of documents, reasons that this race isn't 11, which would be the pure outcome based on job performance. And I think they're already factored in. But yes, they are skeptical. They think Biden's too old, and they think that Trump probably is guilty of something, and that's those two things seem to cancel themselves out.
Now, you've seen the media narrative, and sometimes the media narrative is right, and oftentimes it's wrong. Media narrative now is, oh, well, Biden's making some progress, picking up a point or two here in battleground states. And Bill Maher over the weekend on his show said, he thinks Biden can win. A little bit different than certainly what he was saying a couple of months ago. Um, why do you think that is? And do you see any evidence? Because on the economy, 43% say the economy is strong, 57% say it's weak. Those are bad numbers for Biden. And most think that Biden is getting worse as president, almost 50%. So, well, why do you think that narrative is out there?
Well, I like to think that our poll generally is a little bit ahead of the trend. If you go back the last couple of months, we showed the race closing
True.
following the State of the Union. And so we were in advance of the trend that this race was closing, that Biden was doing somewhat better, that his job approval was improving a little bit. And then this poll comes along and says, nope, that momentum is blunted. He's going to have some other, act here in the campaign to really stimulate that. He's got a focus, I think, much more on the swing voters, and he's got to distance himself more from the left. The more he has shifted his position on Israel, the more his ratings on Israel have gone down, not up, right? Because I really think the key factor in the election that I look at now is men. Okay, men have moved decisively against Biden over I think both the issues and perceptions of weakness, whereas women are sticking with Biden, right? And I think this gender gap is getting stronger, but women have been with Biden for a long time. It's the male defectors here that really is I think the newer story, and why I think that the narrative goes from things are closing, it was better, which we believe, and now, which is, the advantage here is for Trump, unless till we see what happens in this New York trial, in which case everything could go topsy turvy.
And as you mentioned, things are changing. Men are definitely turning against Biden, especially compared to 2020. Trump is doing better with minorities, 48% among African Americans, 44% among Hispanics. And younger voters, obviously that's probably tied to the war, but are leaving Biden. But he's also getting some older voters. Well, how does this all make sense to you?
Well, because people are not voting on the war. The people are voting on inflation and immigration. They're voting on middle class life and issues that they care about in their own lives.
Mm-hmm.
The idea that there's a big war vote out here is really absurd. When you ask people the most important issue, the Israel-Hamas conflict is at the bottom. And so consequently, there are a lot of younger people who have to get a job and pay for things, and for whom inflation is kind of a shock. And attitudes towards the economy and inflation, along with attitudes towards immigration, are the two key issues here that are driving things. I think on the international front, it's less about the war. It's the question is, are we in a strength position, or are we in a weaker position? But even that is I think a very minor influence in the overall election.
And you mentioned top issues: immigration, 35%; price increases; inflation, 35%; economy and jobs, 26%. There have been some. We're not. I know we talked for well over a year that a lot of people thought we'd be in a recession now. That's the good news for Biden, is we're not in a recession. However, most people are not happy with the economy. How long do you think? You said elections are decided pretty soon. We're getting closer. We're getting closer to that date in November. When does Biden? What's the deadline for Biden to at least make progress on these economic numbers? Because that is clearly the number one issue, unless it's immigration.
Look, I think he could move attitudes on the economy a little bit, through June or July. I think generally we found once you get into the shoot of the conventions, it's pretty hard to change attitudes towards the basic issues. You can change who or why they're voting, but you're not going to change their general underlying belief of the facts. And so far, look, we are way removed from, I think, the summer before last, when attitudes towards the economy were really negative. Like, it's quite much more negative than they are now. As an issue, it's come down considerably, but it's still, close to 2/3 negative. Still, a lot of people think inflation is the number one issue, but it is not the crisis point that it was at. So this is a lot better. But immigration has taken off into a kind of a crisis point, and I think people are fighting it out between Biden's age being his weakness and whether or not Trump will be convicted in these cases being his weakness. Um, and I'll go back to what I said initially, which is the most telling numbers for me are how did you rate Trump's job? Even if there's this Trump nostalgia factor here that unless Biden erases, like if I were, doing Biden, then you'd obviously do a lot of fact checking on, the so-called Trump administration successes, maybe, because you can't have 55% thinking Trump did a good job and 44% thinking you're doing a good job. That's going to be a major voting factor come election day, unless those numbers are evened out.
Let's go back to foreign aid because on the foreign policy front, since we last talked, Congress has passed a big foreign aid bill, includes money for Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan. Uh, Israel is the most popular of those three as far as aid. Ukraine 4852. But interestingly, Mike Johnson, the speaker, who did bring a Ukraine bill to the floor that was supported by Democrats and more Democrats than Republicans. And supported by Biden, his numbers are actually above water. He's 30% approval, 27%. That is a highly unusual, as you know, Mark, for congressional leaders who, like Chuck Schumer, Mitch McConnell, anyone in those positions usually is way underwater. What do you attribute that to?
No, I think Mike Johnson had a profiles in courage moment. I think he was perceived as breaking a logjam. Americans prefer action over inaction, even when they don't necessarily agree with everything about it. And I think that he has broken through now. And as you said, it's the first time we've seen one of the party leaders actually have a positive image, because usually the party leaders, they're spending their entire time trying to, get their image burnished among the party faithful, but then all the swing voters and all the other parties turn against them, and so they're usually highly polarizing figures. And remarkable as it is that Johnson, at least for now, overcomes that and is seen as a more neutral leader. And of course, he did to the right what Biden won't do to the left. Uh-huh. And if Biden did the same thing that Johnson did to the left, his numbers would soar too. I mean, I've been saying that message for about a year.
And we're seeing more and more, speaking of that, more and more Democrats publicly raising concerns that protests are going to be a main distraction, or maybe the story of the Democratic convention. Do you think that could really take away any momentum or any bounce for Democrats? Is that the focus will be on protesters? Because obviously they're going to be there in full force.
Well, there are going to be some interesting decisions to be made here. What kind of security are they going to have? Are they going to call the National Guard? Are they not going to call the National Guard? Will they rely? Can they be overrun? Will they be able to? Will the same Democrats who have kind of pushed for the protest vote do everything they can to extinguish a vote at the convention? Because it's not going to be a good look. And in general, these protests are backfiring. In this poll, support for Israel is unchanged, completely unchanged. And the spotlight now is on the universities and what have they done to our kids. Uh-huh. The pictures and so forth of these demonstrations with no American flags. And so these are not landing, well with broad America.
Yeah, the data that you have, 63% say Jewish students on campus are not safe. And we're seeing that, and it's growing. We're seeing different responses from red and blue states to these protesters. But you think that if Biden took on basically the pro-Palestinian crowd, he would get a bump?
Oh, I think if he pushed back against the left on a number of issues, remember immigration here is a big issue. I think if he pushed back on immigration and basically, affirmed a strong position against Iran. I mean, he doesn't have to be pro-Israel. It's really taking a clear view about Iran and Hamas and the bad actors and standing up to them, in a resolute fashion, and how important that is. I mean, how he started off, I think, in this, he got pretty good ratings with his first speech, in which he combined it with the Ukraine.
Hmm.
So we've gotten a lot of support among Democrats for the Ukraine, and I think he could do a lot here in the Mideast, because people look for leadership in these things. Nobody wants war, nobody wants conflict, uh, nobody wants lives lost on any extent. That's not the way Americans function, right? And so consequently, it's up to leadership to really say what's right, what's wrong, and I think that he. But in any event, as I look at the poll numbers, it's pretty clear, to the extent that Biden is losing, it really is among men. It really is among these swing voter men. It's not because the left isn't backing him and so forth. I think that's really the issue.
Interesting finding in the new data is 73% like NATO. And as you know, Mark, Trump, if he wins a second term, is certainly thinking about pulling out of NATO, and there's already legal arguments about whether he can pull out of NATO because Congress has passed legislation on the issue. It's something that John Bolton, who used to work for Trump and now certainly not a Trump fan, is concerned about. What do you make of that? And do you think that could, if Trump does win, could affect what he does, because NATO is pretty popular?
Well, with Trump, you never know what he's really considering, what people say he's considering, what he says he's considering at the moment, but not really considering. I think removal from NATO is one of those things that he would talk about, but I don't think he'd actually do. And if he did, of course, would be seen as highly negative. NATO is like is the bulwark, and I think you've seen this idea of international cooperation across militaries being even more important today. You saw this in the Israel-Iran exchange, where if you did not have the coordination right across the military units of all of the countries out there with the United States, they never would have been able to stop the barrage. So I don't think that's going to play well at all. As a tactic to get others countries to pony up money, that's quite different. Americans do feel that this is a time to look at domestic issues. We asked them, and I thought, well, okay, people are going to say, this is really a time for foreign affairs. No, people said they're concerned about domestic issues, and they're concerned about what they're spending on, other countries in NATO are spending on the military, compared to what we're spending. So if it's just to force more expenditures, that's one thing. Actual withdrawal from NATO, I think would not be supported by anyone but on the extreme right.
One of the things, obviously, that everyone's watching now, and the parlor game of who Trump is going to pick for VP. Kristi Noem used to be in Congress, and now the governor had raised some eyebrows with her new book, saying that she shot one and killed one of her dogs that was certainly misbehaving and killing someone else's chickens, I believe. But anyway, do you think that whether he picks Noem, a lot of people think now he may not, but do you think there'll be a big bounce from whomever he picks, or does it depend on who he picks?
Uh, Again, you've got to look at the problems that you've got, right? And so his problem is with women suburban voters. Nikki Haley would have been by far his best candidate. I think Tim Scott is a very credible candidate. Um, I think Christine, she would have done well to leave that story out of the book.
I agree. Yes.
Well, the difference between what reporters report and your own book is you get to choose
Yes.
what you put in the book, and maybe she thought somehow that was a good story, but it wasn't, and I think that's kind of, I just don't think she has kind of the broad appeal. She'll come off a little bit too much as a Sarah Palin type nominee, uh, which could backfire.
Yeah. And do you think that if he does, let's say, whether it's Noam or another female, do you think it would be wise for him, because Trump has problems with women, like Biden has trouble with men, that picking a woman would help him? I mean, here we have Harris, obviously a woman. RFK Jr. picked a woman as his running mate. Do you think Trump's going to pick a woman?
Uh, I just don't know that he's got somebody who is going to fit the criteria,
Right.
and who he get along with. And I just haven't seen on the list of nominees. But obviously you would start from that premise. But I think that he's also made a big effort to try to get minority voters, and that's why I think Scott is a very strong contender, and Scott has been, as Trump likes to say, more effective at pushing Trump than he was at his own candidacy.
Joe Biden has not been media accessible. There are a number of reporters and people in the fourth estate I talked to, and he's not been as media accessible, nowhere close to Trump when he was president. But I want to get your thoughts on Biden went on Howard Stern's show on Sirius XM and had a long interview. They talked about tragedies in Biden's life. Remember, Biden skipped the Super Bowl interview, which I thought was a complete mistake this year. Huge audience. Not like he would get some tough questions, sure. But do you think he's got to pick up his media presence? And what did you make of that Howard Stern interview? Howard Stern, as we know, is not a Trump fan anymore, so he knew he was going into not quite the lion's den of interviews.
I don't think the Howard Stern interview is going to, make a big difference
Mm-hmm.
here. Again, you kind of look addressing some of the core issues, pushing off against the left so that you position yourself more in the center. Those are going to make a big difference. I think the press can complain he's not accessible, and the only people who are going to care about that are the press.
Yes, that's true.
And the team is going to go, we're going to do what's successful, and we're not going to put ourselves into risk just because the press is baiting us or unhappy. And I think that the Biden team has been resolute about that. We're going to put our candidate in situations where we're confident that he can come out a winner. And I think that's what they're doing, and I don't think they're going to change that, no matter what the New York Times says.
Yeah, no. Listen, I thought it was a good move that he did that interview, and as everyone wants, we want debates. We'll see if we have debates. I did want to ask you. There's so much the electorate is angry, and they don't like the economy, and they're worried about immigration. But you also had to end on more of a happy note. You had asked some questions about people connecting with friends and family and kind of life questions. What were your takeaways there? It was kind of a little unusual from your normal fare, and I thought it was kind of uplifting.
Yes, I did that because I had seen another poll that asked people whether or not they were nervous or not, and it didn't ask them about any of the positive things.
Right.
And so then they put out this release that says, oh, young people are nervous and unhappy. And so I did the opposite and said, well, how often do you have a happy feeling? And then I put in the nervous feelings too, because so you could put the context in it. It turned out that people were often feeling pretty happy these days in their own lives, and that it's not all doom, gloom, and unhappiness. That nearly every week they're getting moments here. Friends, do you have a connection? I think the number one feeling that people had, say in the last 2 weeks, would you say you felt the following nearly every day, more than half the days, several days? The number one thing they got was feeling of connection with friends and family. And Democrats, 41%, Republicans, 39%, and independents, interestingly, less connection.
Interesting.
33%. Joy, 27 to 33. Enjoyment of life through sports and entertainment, Democrats a little bit more. Sense of satisfaction, Democrats a little bit more. But nervous, then I said, are you nervous or anxious? much lower percentages. Democrats were both happier and more nervous. Independents were only 12%, and then feeling down, depressed, or hopeless, 19% Democrats, 13 Republicans, and 11% independents. So Democrats seem to feel more emotions generally. Republicans, slightly lower, but very similar pattern, and independents more removed from feelings on both ends of the spectrum. But I just wanted to put in perspective that I was actually curious: would it be joy? What would really accomplishment? It was this sense of connection with friends and family that really came through as the emotion that people experience most.
Yeah, that is very interesting. Last thoughts? Anything I missed? We're approaching 6 months ago to the election. Obviously, Trump is the favorite now, but a lot can change in the next 6 months.
Well, look, universities are in the hot seat here. Okay, I think we did ask anti-Semitism 69%. We also said Islamophobia 59%. On these universities, but as you said, a lot of feeling that Jewish students are unsafe. But this turn on the universities is really interesting. They don't think the universities are doing enough, and then we asked them, are institutions of higher learning functioning well, or is there a problem with what they're teaching kids today? Right, and that was 64% said that there was a problem with what they're teaching kids today, and then we asked them, what do you think the problem is? And the number one answer was teaching theories that racially divide us. So I was curious. People felt there's something wrong with the universities. They pinpointed what they think is wrong with the universities. Out of a list, failing to be rigorous was on the bottom. This was on the top, and I think universities have to take note of both what's happening on the campuses and the images that they've projected out there.
Yeah, it is terrible that there are some commencement graduation ceremonies being canceled because the concern about violence. Protests are fine, but violence is not fine. And the other thing to think about, a lot of these kids didn't have high school graduations because of COVID, and now maybe not able to celebrate because of all the unrest. It's really unfortunate, but it's one. Do you think, Mark? Just obviously, colleges are going to be letting out graduations. Do you think these protests just pick up in the fall?
Well, I don't know. We're not seeing, as I said, if I look at the broad data, do you favor Israel or Hamas? It's 80-20. It's exactly what it was. If I ask people, do you favor, and I also did take some of the questions from everyone else, do you favor a permanent ceasefire? First of all, there's no such thing. A ceasefire is temporary. That is the definition. But of course, 70% would favor it. But then I said, follow up, well, yes, but would you favor a ceasefire with keeping people in place, or only after the hostages are released and after Hamas is taken out of governance? And almost 68% said no. When I want a ceasefire after the hostages are out and Hamas is taken out. So you got to, the data here is pretty ambiguous. These protests aren't moving things, but there's a dedicated group of protesters, and they're going to find other avenues. And they're going to, from the campuses, will they go, to Wall Street? Will they go to the bridges? Because I think the Israeli operation is not going to be over for some extended period of time. They are moving slowly and carefully, trying to wend their way here between Washington, the rest of the world, and having to deal with a situation that frankly would have taken, took U.S. military many years to deal with similar situations. And they have done so, I think at this point, in any event, before they move into Rafah, if they move into Rafah, on a period of time here that is going to really, I think still have American support, but still have a lot of protests that are out there in the streets. And regardless of the protests, Americans are going to vote on inflation, immigration, interest rates, fuel prices, and their own lives, because that's what they're fundamentally concerned about.
Yep, yeah, without a doubt. Protesters are going to be a theme of this election year, but whether they're able to move the needle, we shall see. And so far, they have not. Interesting polling, Mark. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Bob.